Jess and this is Vox Populi. Today I'm honoured to be joined by Malcom, who is a fertility expert, pronatalist. How are you doing today?
Absolutely spectacular. It is wonderful to be here talking to you.
Well, thank you so much for agreeing to this interview. So the first question I want to ask is, why are birth rates falling in the West?
Well, they're falling everywhere. They're not just falling in the West. With people, they try to frame this as like, oh, you're just concerned about Europe. And I'm like, well, the problem's worse in Korea. Is that West? The problem's worse in China. It's worse in Japan. Right now, if you're looking like just at America, they're like, oh, so it's the developed world. No. In South America and Central America, fertility rates are falling much faster than they are in the United States or Europe, to the point where all the way back in 2019, collectively, South and Central America fell below replacement rate. And now you have a number of countries there approaching a fertility rate, TFR, children per woman, of 1. These are countries like Chile and Uruguay and Costa Rica, which is terrifying because these countries are also dealing with an outflow of immigrants, which basically means that tons of old people are going to starve to death. But the question is why is it happening everywhere on Earth? A lot of people are like, oh, this trend started out of nowhere in the 80s. And it's like, no, it became relevant in the 80s because a fertility rate that had been falling for 200 years since the Industrial Revolution crossed the 2 children per woman line. And then it started to matter to people. But in reality, what happened was the Industrial Revolution. It used to be that you had more kids, you increased your quality of life. That was more hands on the farm, more little hands in the factory that could bring home money to the family. But today, every kid you have dramatically impacts your quality of life. And so while for a hedonistic purpose, you might be able to motivate somebody to have 1 kid, maybe 2 kids, you need less of people having like 5 or 6 kids for a population to stay stable, and you're just not going to get that. So for example, there was a study done in the UK recently that showed that around 50% of this upcoming generation doesn't want kids at all. That means for the population to stay stable, the other 50% has to have 4 or more kids. You don't motivate that by saying kids are fun, right? You need an exogenous motivation. And for most people who have a lot of kids, that motivation is cultural or religious. You can say demand outweighs supply, but what is meant by this is with our current cultural context. If you look in the United States, many cultures used to, for example, the Irish immigrants, when they came over, it'd be like 5 families to 1 house. What you mean is, if I have 1 house for 1 person, like 1 2-bedroom house, or I expect every kid to get their own room, or all of these other very indulgent, hedonistic things that were not cultural norms in the past. In reality, we are nowhere near Earth's carrying capacity, and we are about to have a rapidly declining global population. This matters a lot economically because a lot of the systems that we built, whether it's Social Security in the US, for example, or your system of, I don't know what you call it in the UK, where you give money to old people so they don't die on the streets, it required taking taxes from the younger generation to pay for the old people. When you are having maybe 3 or 4 young person supporting 1 old person, fine, that kind of works, right? But when you have 2 old people for every 1 productive person in the country, that stops working. And I think every person around our age knows, when we joke about it, like in the US, it's like, I know I'm never going to get Social Security. The government's still not going to be able to afford. But we don't take into account the true horror of what we're saying. If these systems collapse, millions of people are going to die hopeless deaths that were completely preventable. But it's worse than that. You also have the underpinnings of the entire economic system will stop working because we built our entire economy on the assumption that it grows on average. But it only grows on average because the number of producers and consumers is growing on average. The productivity per producer for about the past 200 years has been growing linearly, even though the technology has been growing exponentially. People can be like, well, maybe you can replace people with AI, and that could fix the problem. Maybe, but that's very unlikely to fix any of the economic parts of the problem, even if AI does for the elite fix the economy. By that, what I mean is what AI functionally does, even if it comes in as a rescuer, is it makes 50%, 80% of the population largely irrelevant, and then it concentrates that wealth in fewer and fewer hands, and never in history has a elite faction with concentrated wealth voluntarily, without some sort of exogenous motivator, given up that power that they had. For example, when Athens invented the democracy, that was because the wealthy made their money off of trade networks and they needed untrained people to man the triremes, so they needed to bring them in and make them feel like stakeholders in the political system. When the Magna Carta happened, that was right after the Black Death. It killed a lot of people, and so it increased the bargaining power of the serfs and of the land, the small nobility. That is the exact opposite of the situation we're seeing right now. So even if somehow globally we get out of a complete economic collapse, the economic collapse will be felt by the average British citizen. With fertility rates being what they are, it's going to be bad.
One of the concerns could be that if we continue increasing our fertility rate, again, I feel like it's less of an issue now, but during the early 2000s, there were so many movies about overpopulation. Will there be a time where we get to that point, and is that an issue we should consider?
Well, it's completely unrealistic. It's like we can't get there at this point. Fertility rates are already at such a low level and continuing to fall at such a rate that in a world where the population is higher than it is now, no matter how good my advocacy is not possible. As I often say to people, I am not here trying to save Europe. Europe is gone. If the world is the Titanic, you guys already hit the iceberg. I'm just trying to convince the captains that this boat is actually sinkable and that we need to be getting the lifeboats ready for whatever system comes after this one when it starts to collapse. Because just economically, geopolitically, we didn't build any of this. Take London, for example. If London is at half its current population, it doesn't cost half of what it costs today to run. The sewer system still costs the same to keep operational. The roads still cost the same to keep operational. The economic model that keeps a city like London working stops functioning if it begins to rapidly depopulate. And keep in mind that in the UK, you might be able to solve this by taking in immigrants, but even if you're able to do that, you are destroying the economies of the countries where you are taking those people from, because many of those countries are also dealing with a desperate demographic situation right now. Again, this isn't just a developed world thing, it's a developing world thing.
What's the situation like in Africa? Aren't they having an overpopulation problem?
So in Africa, the only countries, if you look at a map of country income by fertility rate, because a lot of people are like, you can't afford kids. And it's like, well, in England, the less money you have, the more kids you have. In the world, the less money a country has, the more kids they have. So no, it's not that you can't afford it. But in Africa specifically, a country will only be above repopulation rate, and not every country in Africa is, if the average person is earning less than 5,000 USD per year. So basically they have to be in a state of such desperate poverty that they're basically not engaged with the market economy. If the UK's survival, or all of Europe's survival, depends upon keeping these countries at that state of poverty, that's a really bad structural incentive to set. Worse, if you're just importing, if your problem for Social Security and old people is we'll import people from Africa to support a bunch of non-working white people, the optics of that also aren't great. So Africa really isn't the solution. Worse, if you're importing people from Africa and then you acculturate them, you make them British, right? Well, if something about being British or the culture that you fostered in this country leads to people not wanting to have kids, as we have seen after immigrants come into a country, they stop having kids, then being British is fundamentally unsustainable. Whatever culture you or Europe has built is fundamentally unsustainable. And so you get a choice. Do you want to try to build a new culture? Do you want to attempt to alter that culture? Or do you just say, I'll go have cocktails while the whole city's burning down and, there's nothing I can really do. I try to take the standpoint of there is a way to fix this for some people, but it comes down to the individual level, people's own choices around marriage, having kids, and the way they do I put all my kids in one room? Yeah, because that's what's financially realistic.
So why do you think the fertility rate, why do you think so many young people aren't choosing to have kids?
Well, because they have bought into a culture, the urban monoculture, which is fundamentally hedonistic. It tells you that you should do whatever makes you feel good, whatever gives you fulfillment, so long as it doesn't interfere with anyone else, But be validated for whatever you want to believe about yourself, and anything that interferes with this, anything that causes in the moment emotional pain, triggers, right, is a negative thing and should be removed from society. So it attempts to create a society without emotional pain, without challenge, where the goal is maximizing, if not for your self-pleasure, at least across a population. In a society that does that, it's very difficult to motivate sacrifice, or even understand why sacrifice might be a good thing. Worse, it's a society that tells people that they should hate their culture, that they should hate their ancestors. If I tell, the reason why people have kids, the reason why Israel, for example, is not having a fertility crisis, despite their wealth, is because people in Israel like the Jews. People in British don't like the British. They haven't been taught to respect the British. They haven't been taught to want to make more British people. And this is fundamental. No, you go to your average white woman in Britain, and you're like, you should make more white British people. They're like, well, aren't white British people bad? Like, that's going to be very hard motivation to make, given the way the education system and the dominant culture has come to relate to your own ancestry.
Do you think we should be worried about who we are incentivizing to have lots of kids? Because I grew up in like a working class background, for example, and most of the people around me had maybe one or two siblings. But the ones who had more siblings were the ones who grew up on social housing on a council estate. Do you think that's an issue?
It's a massive issue. And it's something that when you do pro-fertility policy, it can't be universal. Because if you do something like cash handouts or something like that, that dollar is worth incrementally more to an individual the less economically productive that individual is. And it would be great if I lived in a society where anyone, no matter who they're born to, has exactly an equal economic shot. We have been trying to build that society for the past 100 years. That's been like the major civilizational project we've been working on. We haven't figured it out yet. Now we are dealing with a moment in history where we can't assume we're going to figure it out in this next generation. We know we're not going to figure it out in this next generation. And if I in the US just, for example, pay people on welfare to have lots of kids, well, those kids, we know from studies, are 3 times more likely to be on welfare themselves. At the end of the day, the problem isn't exactly fertility rates. It is fertility rates among taxpayers. And so you can't just spam kids to solve this issue. That's also why indiscriminate immigration also doesn't necessarily act as a panacea to this problem. And it's also why the problem, economically speaking, is so much worse than just the decline that we're seeing right now. So a lot of people, they try to calculate what Britain's economy is going to be with more or less people in the future, as if every human in Britain has the same probability of contributing to the economy. But that's just not true. It's not just that the more economically productive countries or the wealthier countries have a lower fertility rate, but the more economically productive regions within a country have a much lower fertility rate. So in the UK, if you look at a place like London, it's going to have a much lower fertility rate than a more struggling area, but the kids born within that region are more likely to be higher taxpayers, and even within London, the people who are earning the most are the ones who are least likely to have kids. The effects this is going to have on an economy are going to be much, much bigger than if you're just calculating, oh, we have X many people not in the economy.